Now the video I put up recently includes much of the stuff on the board here, but I added something. So those who just saw the video the other day, I've added the things in green here to clarify and tighten up and make it a little more precise. So I'm going to start with a quick review though on the nature of God, as I say, as a human experience. A lot of people argue whether there's a God or if there's a God, what that God is, those types of things. But as a therapist, I like to say God, in quotes, as a human experience is really simple. It's when we experience some form of divinity within, which is most or best expressed by the feeling state we have as we're doing certain activities. Our general mental health, whether or not addiction is a burden for us, in my case, sports, playing sports or watching sports. If I have a divine feeling, I can go with the flow. I can accept losses much easier. I actually can bowl or golf better if I am in touch with the divinity. And if I'm not, I tend to do worse, just saying. And that's true for everyone I've ever worked with. I see addiction clear up by people who tap into the Holy Spirit, right? And so that is God as a human experience. In the loop that I did, again, I did a whole half hour on this, just one of the most recent videos. If you want to see that, the loop is this. We start out as pure consciousness, or known as a spiritual being, and then we have a human experience. I've got it here in red, because our consciousness, which is the same for all of us at its source, pure consciousness, mixes with ego experience. I had a friend describe this as like white paint. You go to Lowe's or Home Depot and you ask for some paint. I believe they start with white, then they dip some colors in and they make you the color that you want, right? Pure white consciousness, if you will, the purity of consciousness is the origin of all of us. Then we get born in different situations. Different families, different communities, different cultures, different religions, okay? Different experiences and different names and all that kind of stuff. And that is the ego experience. We get dazed and confused. Everyone goes through this, right? All of us. We forget in this process the origin of our consciousness. Remember, in science, they call it a hard problem because they don't know where it comes from. It's up to each of us to figure it out. And if you tap into the origin of your consciousness, you have the experience of, oh, there it is. And now you don't need to force it down other people's throats, okay? The fact is, you know it's true. Meanwhile, we're all on this chase, whether we know it or not. The way to get to that, to return off the ego experience to that, is why Jesus says in John 14:6, he is the way. He's the way, because was Jesus laden with ego? No. Was he an open, loving, forgiving, patient, kind person? Yes. Did he also tell people off if he needed to? Yes. Was he afraid to be assertive? No. Okay? And so like he was the perfect balance of masculine and feminine. And there's plenty of other prophets and teachers and just good people throughout the world that are practicing this too, okay? And so there's a lot of ways the way comes together, but Jesus being a great example of it is what John 14:6 is, okay? And as we continued on, we talk about from the movie Lost Symbol or the book Lost Symbol, when we are in tune with the vibration, we're going to talk about that in a little bit again, our consciousness touches the source of knowledge. So whenever you tap into the being in tune with the nature of the world, then we have an experience of the divine and it flows through us, and that is what I call God, okay? As opposed to thinking of it as Sky Daddy, some punitive big father in the sky who's disappointed in all our physical mistakes. You have an experience of pure consciousness which says, it's okay, this is a tough game. We all get dazed and confused, okay? We all mess up. We're all sinners, so to speak. And then it's all relieved from you. It's all removed from you when you return to that awareness, because then you are born again. Instead of being born once just of flesh, you're born again of spirit. That recognition, of course, makes you understand why all is forgiven. It's where I quote Madame de Stael, the French philosopher feminist from a couple hundred years ago. If you understood all, you'd forgive all. Once you understand that everyone has to return to the source, everyone has to forgive, and everyone has to forgive everything. Course in Miracles is all about this. To be able to forgive everything, like Madame de Stael says, is to return to the source. It's the Alpha and the Omega. And all of us are playing this game. We're just at different phases of confusion, if you will. Okay, so we've touched pure consciousness, then we have the experience of the way, pure consciousness flows through us, and then we have improved mental health, addiction symptoms go down, you're better at sports, we're better at music, we're better at dancing, well maybe not in my case. We're better at all things that we're trying to do because the divine is running through us. And then what do we give credit to? Well, the Holy Spirit, of course. It's what's improved us. And as we're about to talk about specific teachings from the Tao on this, and why it is that no one can boast, or why we shouldn't boast, is because you're only good at what you do because the Spirit is moving through you. And if you're good at it for ego purposes, it won't last long. Eventually, you'll have to retire physically. You're going to have to figure this out. It's why we have to be careful and mindful of judging people for where they're at in their development, because it's pretty hard to tell. Okay? So that was all last week. And the point is, God is pure consciousness. And our job is to experience God that way on earth as pure consciousness, freed from the burdens of the ego and the confusion that the ego brings. So today we're going to talk about some specific ideas of what the way is. The way Jesus is talking about in John 14:6. And as I said last week, early Jewish Christians called themselves the way. Okay? Jesus had just said he was the way, and the Jewish Christians called themselves that. As I understand it, the way, early Christians, ended up becoming the Catholic Church. It was initially the way, which I just think is ironic because that's exactly what the Tao means in Chinese. And so we're going to combine these two things. We'll start with Jesus. Actually, we'll start with the concept that throws a lot of people off. Like Einstein says, the world's an illusion. It's a persistent one. And it's a persistent illusion because we think it's physical. And then most people that approach religion or even mental health approach it from the perspective, if I could just make my physical life better, I'd feel better. Okay? And yet, no, it's not going to be the case. If that were the case, Elvis would be about 80 years walking the earth right now because he had it all as an American, you'd think. But boy, history's filled with people who had it all, good looks and fame and fortune and all that, and yet they were miserable. That's because if you don't return or remember that you're perfect, pure consciousness, then you're going to suffer. Buddha mentions that directly as well, okay? So we get confused because, I like to say, there's physical laws. There's four primary ones. Gravity, electromagnetism, the strong nuclear force, and the weak nuclear force. In physics, those are the four primary forces. But we're going to just focus on gravity for a minute. Here it is, almost 7 o'clock. Have any of you thought of gravity yet today? And talking to people out there on the internet, have you thought of gravity yet today? And yet, gravity's working the whole time, right? They didn't stop working. Did gravity work on you all day long? Or did any of you just start floating around? Okay? Gravity always, even on the moon, gravity works. It's just less of a pull. That's the experience, at least. And so gravity always works. The four nuclear forces I just described, or the four fundamental forces, are always working. And yet you guys didn't pay attention to the electromagnetic force today yet, have you? And yet it was working. Okay? These are physical laws you could describe. There's a lot more than that even. But they're physical. And if you look at the world physically, that's what you'll pay attention to. However, in Matthew 5:17, Jesus says, I didn't come to abolish the laws. I came to fulfill them. And why do I link that? He's talking about he's not coming to abolish the things that the prophets before him said. It's just that they focused on things physically. They focused on things you needed to do in order to impress Sky Daddy, okay? Things that you needed to do to be a good spiritual being. And Jesus says, I'm not coming to get rid of that stuff. He's not coming to get rid of physical laws. He's coming to inject spirituality into them. He's coming specifically to fulfill them, because the point of physical laws, and ultimately the religious laws too, the point were not to do them physically, the point's to do them spiritually. A couple months ago, I did a whole video on this. You can look it up. I'm going to touch on a couple of them maybe a little bit different. I'll give you an example of how he came to fulfill a law. In Leviticus 19:18, which was pre-Jesus' time, it's in the Torah, and Jesus was a Jewish man, and they studied the Torah. In Leviticus 19:18, it says, love thy neighbor as thyself. Now, if we were to take that literally physically, I should go home and I guess, instead of making my bed, my wife's here, so I'm pointing at her, right? If I make her bed, or if I make our bed, I should go do the neighbor's too, right? And if I do it physically, every time I say fill up my car, I should fill up my neighbor's car. And if that's what we're supposed to do, if it's taken literally, I should spend every Christmas with my neighbor, right? Or I should focus on everything I do physically for myself, for my family, for all people physically. Is that even sustainable? Is it even possible? And yet that's how people think of it, like the golden rule, is to do unto another as you'd have them do unto you. And if you take that physically, that means I should give you for Christmas what I want for Christmas, right? If I give you for my birthday what I want. The idea of like, I need, new golf clubs, so I should get you new golf clubs or whatever. That's doing for another what you'd want them to do for you, if taken physically, okay? Well, the point of this is it's not physical. Jesus fulfilled the physical sounding laws, as we're going to do with two stories about wells in a minute. He fulfilled them with spiritual teachings. And so loving another as oneself is quite literally to recognize others are playing the same game as you. And the best thing I can do for you, like Ram Dass says, is to bring more spirit into myself. I'll give you spirit, you give me spirit. That's loving another as oneself, and it's also the golden rule. What I want you to give me is patience and mercy and forgiveness and the Holy Spirit, and I'll give you that. See, that works. And now I don't have to go over my neighbor and make her bed, okay? I don't have to follow physical laws if I'm following the energetic spiritual laws that Jesus came to fulfill, okay? And so that's loving a neighbor as oneself. And if you want to get good at this, we're going to end on the Krishna teaching today along those lines. If we want to get good at this, this includes everybody, and we have to do it energetically or spiritually, okay? Another example of this, in Luke 14:5, it's the story of keeping the Sabbath, and how Jesus, the Sabbath is often thought of as Sunday, and that you're supposed to take Sundays off. You can work Monday through Saturday, but on Sundays, take a break. And that's physical. The whole idea of I need to take off Sundays. And a lot of religious people operate that way. Jesus, of course, teases, maybe rolls his eyes a little bit, and he says, come on. If your child or a donkey fell into a well on a Sunday, would you do some work to get it out of there? Of course you would. Please don't take the Sabbath literally and make it Sundays. What does the Sabbath mean? It means taking a break to focus on your spiritual development. It's tithing. It's not about writing a check to the church. It's about taking some of your physical consciousness, the ego experience, and flipping it into spirit. It's working on alchemy. It's making oneself capable of bringing the Tao to earth, as the Tao says, and being a spiritual being. That's what the Sabbath is. We have to practice this. And so to keep it holy, to keep this experience holy, we need to practice our spiritual development. And we have to practice it spiritually. There's gazillions of ways to do that. We shouldn't be telling other people how to do it, but prophets taught us what it is we need to do, and it's to be a spiritual being in physical form. Okay? So that's Luke 14:5, and then he backs it up with another story about a well. In John 4:13 and 14, he meets the woman at the well, and he says to her, if you drink from this well, you'll be thirsty again. But if you drink from the well that I tend, you'll never be thirsty again. Because the well that Jesus and the water that he was offering, he calls spirit-giving water or life-giving water. Is he talking about literal water or some sort of special potion? Of course not. He's talking about the Holy Spirit that he was offering. That it came straight out of him into you. That's what he was teaching. You want to read it literally? And then we're going to be loving our neighbor in a strange way. We're going to be not working on Sundays. And if our donkey falls into a well, it's just going to drown because you're not out of work. Okay? And we're going to understand that drinking physical water isn't the answer, is it? But drinking spiritual water is what Jesus is talking about. See, it's a metaphor. And that's how he came to fulfill. That's just a couple examples. There's hundreds of them, really. We stop taking it so physically, make it spiritual. That's how he fulfills the law. In fact, if you go through the quantum physics like we have in New Eyes, all of the aspects of quantum physics, the superposition and relativity, the observer effect, entanglement, all of that, are physical laws that we are here to fulfill. The more I, as an observer, see the world from a spiritual perspective, the more the world is going to reflect back to me like a mirror, a spiritual world. But the more I see it from the ego perspective, the more that gets reflected back to me. And if I'm your teammate, it's better for me to look at the world spiritually in a unifying way. And it's the same back towards me. And so then you become my teammate and vice versa. But most people argue about this stuff because they take it physically. Then they argue about what we're supposed to be doing. American government comes to mind again. Argue about what we're supposed to be doing. And yet all you're supposed to be doing, as Jesus teaches, one of my favorite verses of his recently, I desire mercy, not sacrifice. And demanding that you do something that's called a sacrifice, or you demand that someone else do something that we might call a sacrifice, is not what he's looking for. He's not looking for us to not eat certain things or to not do certain things. He says mercy. Why? Because mercy brings spirit into you. Mercy is letting yourself off the hook, forgiving yourself, letting your mistakes go, but also letting others go. All right? And that brings the spirit into you, and that is the way. And all these teachings are a way. Give yourself some time to practice the Sabbath, which just means spiritual development. That's part of the way. To love your neighbor. Hey, let's face it. It's love your neighbor, love your enemy. Love is the end of this. That's because the source is the beginning, and it's also love. So our job is to love everything, and that is the way, as he taught us. And you could either drink from the physical world, the metaphor of the well, or drink from the spiritual world. Doing so is the way. Okay? And as we talked last week in the law symbol again, the whole idea is once you do this, your consciousness touches the source of knowledge. And then everything shifts. Then as the Buddha says, once you practice something that seems to be true, if it stays true for you, then you know that it's true. It's self-evident. It becomes self-evident. Because you practice something like forgiveness, man, that stuff works, okay? No one forgives and then wants to go back to resenting. Then you practice seeing each other as equals. Everybody, without exception. Just different levels of growth. Aren't acorns and oak trees equals? Just in different levels of development? Aren't caterpillars and butterflies equals? Just in different levels of development? We've got a world, a big world out there, and people at different levels of development. It's our job to see each other as equals and not judge each other for better or worse relative to one's behaviors. Jesus fulfills the law by bringing spirit to every single circumstance without fail. Okay? And so, as we slide into this more of the way, I've got a couple things written here that just back up everything that Jesus said. It's how it all fits together. The third noble truth of the Buddhas is the answer to all of this is detachment. But it's not quitting on the world, it's quitting on our expectations and our specific desires for things to go a certain way physically. And if you let that go as we go through the Tao, as we let that go, and we let our expectations go, doesn't something special happen? The forces of the universe start to flow through us, as I talked about here. Pure consciousness flows through you, instead of ego consciousness, which flows through us most of the time. Pure consciousness flows through us, and then this happens. The first verse of the Tao ends with, ever desireless, one can see the mystery, but ever desiring, one only sees manifestations. See, when we break free of the desire of the ego expectation, the Holy Spirit or the Tao itself flows through you. And then, as it explains later on, it corrects everything. It puts you in sync. It gives you experiences that corrects you. Okay? And you give credit to it because you got the ego out of the way. But if not, ever desiring, one only sees manifestations. That's because if we're stuck in ego mode, we keep projecting that into the world. That's the physics again. Laws being fulfilled through spirit. If we're projecting ego into the world as the observer, superposition kicks back to us physical stuff. And it's variable. Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. And that's going to frustrate you. Now we're back to Buddha's third truth. Or his first truth is that you're going to suffer because you look at the world through an ego lens. But then once you drop that, and without desire, and again, it doesn't mean you don't have a level of desire. It's just secondary to your primary desire, which is being a spiritual being, being born again. Now I'm without desire, and then I can see the mystery. And then you go, oh, I get it. We're all doing this. No one's not doing this. Just different levels of development. And then a bunch of other stuff shows up. And there's like 80 some verses of the Tao. I'm just going to read from a couple of them. In verse 10, it says, carrying body and soul and embracing the one, can you avoid separation? So I already drew this last week. You start out as soul, pure consciousness, then you take on a body. Are you going to get separated by that fact? Once you take on a body, do you forget what you are? If so, you just got separated. But can you carry a body and remember what you are? Can you do the things together? Can you embrace the one? I'm a spiritual being, you're a spiritual being. We all come from the source. We're playing this crazy game of hide and seek. We got lost. We have to be found again. Jesus says, seek and you'll find. And so, can you keep from being separated? There's the challenge. And then it says, can you let your body become as supple as a newborn's child? Doesn't Jesus say approach heaven as a child? Why? Physically speaking, how supple is a baby? I remember when our baby was young and he slept great. There was a time or two you could pick him up, like hang him upside down by his foot. He was just like laying there. He didn't care. He was totally supple, and babies are often like that. Very flexible, okay? Very supple. Are we like that physically speaking as adults or energetically or emotionally? No. We get fixated on a perspective in life that is myopic. It's my way because that's my experience and yours is wrong. That's not supple, that's rigid. And a peacemaker, like Jesus talks about, is somebody who can embrace other people's perspectives without judgment. And yet we're not there. We got a bunch of people who are seeing the world from an ego perspective without any forgiveness, and they're rigid in their perspective. They're not supple at all. And the Tao is saying, can you be supple? In the opening and shutting of heaven's gate, And there's where Ganesh comes in. The opening and shutting of heaven's gate, which is getting back to this state of consciousness, it says, can you play the feminine part? Which this book describes quite clearly as the feminine role is to receive the Tao. Now, what's the Lord's Prayer say? On earth as it is in heaven, okay? It's the same thing. Can we bring down to earth the Holy Spirit? Can we bring down to earth the Tao? And can we play the feminine role? Feminine receives. If you want to make feminine about gender, feel free. That's physical. But if you make feminine about spiritual, it's all the virtues of the feminine. We'll call it stereotypes. It's the patient and the nurturing, and it's the compassion, the receiving, and all that kind of stuff. And the feminine role is the role that we're all playing when it comes to this. Because I, just as you, have to play the feminine role and bring the Tao into my experience. That's verse 10 of the Tao. And to do so, we have to remain supple. Here we go, verse 24. It says, showing off does not reveal enlightenment. Boasting will not produce accomplishment. He who is self-righteous is not respected, and he who brags will not endure. When walking the path of the Tao, this is the very stuff that must be uprooted, thrown out, and left behind. It's clearly ego. Clearly. It has to get uprooted and left behind. If you're bragging about what you did, let's face it, most of what we succeed at is because of circumstance. You were given an environment that was conducive to succeeding. You might have been given DNA that was conducive to succeeding, okay? Perhaps a community that supported you in a way that helped you succeed. History is filled with people with great talent that didn't succeed because it wasn't nurtured. A lot of people get nurtured the right way and they succeed. And a lot of people, if they take credit for it, they're missing the point. They're also full on in their ego mode. I'm special. Like the Course in Miracles says, all of us are unique. None of us are special. Why is that? Because all of us have this perfect pure consciousness inside of us. All of us do. And yet we experience it in a unique way. All these very interesting ways we experience it, we call it diversity. Thank goodness there's a solution to that. And it's to see not special, all unique, and my job is to see all of us as a spiritual collective, and that's your job as well. So it's fair, isn't it? And then in verse 37, it says, by not wanting there is calm, and the world will straighten itself. When there is silence, and it doesn't mean silence here, it's silence in our heads. It's silence in our hearts. When we're calm and cool and collected and accepting and tolerant and all of that. When there is silence, one finds the anchor of the universe within oneself. Okay? Because what's the ego? The ego is the thing that yaps on and on and on, right? It's talking to us all day long. The ego is the thing that's judging good and bad. I wish I didn't do this. I wish you didn't do that. This is what needs to happen for me to feel good and all that kind of stuff. Not true. And if it's true, it's temporary. It won't last. Okay? And so that chatter goes on inside our heads. But when there's silence, we find the anchor of the universe inside ourselves. Well, here we go. Last symbol. When we are in tune with the vibration, all this stuff I just described is the vibration. All this stuff is backing off the idea that I have any type of control. And calming the mind, which is chattering that I'm bad because or I'm good because, all of that. And recognizing that we're all playing the same game from different angles. That's relativity. And once you do that, you've just tapped into the source of consciousness, and then you remember. What is it that you remember? Oh, that's right, you're Christ too. Just like Jesus came to show us. Or the Buddha. Buddha said, you're Buddha too. All of us are playing the same game, and then you remember. And the anchor of the universe is in you. Everyone in the world has this inside of them. You can't not. An acorn can't grow up to be a corn, even though it's called an acorn. It has to be an oak tree, okay? You can't grow up to be anything else other than what you are. You will eventually remember that you are pure consciousness. According to many philosophies, it might take multiple lifetimes. The Kabbalah, however, I was happy to see all of us, it's given to us in this lifetime to get the job done. Kabbalah also teaches reincarnation. If you don't get in this lifetime, don't worry, you'll have another, okay? And that's okay. Now, some people don't teach reincarnation directly. Why is it? Because it doesn't do any good, like Jesus says, to focus on past lives or future lives. You got to focus on now. It's given to you now to remember what you are. And your life circumstances are set up perfectly. Whatever it is you need to experience, you are, okay? And you don't need to judge it. As soon as you judge it as good or bad, you just lost it, okay? Okay? And so the anchor of the universe is found inside of you, because what is God? God is pure consciousness, and you've got that too. Everybody has that, and we can return back to that. And this leads to something we said last week, and we're ending with it. The ability or the experience of finding that anchor inside of yourself is what Krishna is talking about when he says, if you perceive the unity in separate creatures, you attain the infinite spirit. Okay? The very thing that feels really good, the flow of the Holy Spirit through us, it's what produces endorphins and GABA and serotonin and dimethyltryptamine and dopamine and all these good drugs inside our head that we're trying to use like off the street to have a fake experience of this. Temporary, obviously. And everyone that's trying to use drugs or alcohol to medicate their consciousness can experience that by perceiving the unity in all of us. And if you recognize that, imagine the world is 8 billion people, or think of your life as all the people that you know, and if it's 100 or whatever, that's fine. We all started at the same point, and then all of a sudden it's hide and seek. Go play, go get lost, and everybody gets lost. And then the game is remembering, is finding each other again, and remembering who you are. And then what do? Help others remember who they are. That's actually fun. Well, what would happen if the whole world got this? And realized, wait a minute, instead of arguing all the time, and fighting about right and wrong, what we do is help each other remember who we are, as is, I believe, completely backed up by the prophets and the physics. And when one has the experience of it, like Ram Dass says, you don't need to argue. The Tao goes on to say, a sage doesn't speak, he waits to be asked. Muhammad says, there is no compulsion in religion. Truth stands out clear from error. If you understood what I just said, truth stands out clear from error. Once you experience this, it's true, period. Nothing else needs to be discussed. You also know that you better be patient. Love is patient, it says in Corinthians, because it takes a lot of people, a lot of time, and who knows how many lifetimes I've been working on this. We don't know this, do we? I've got plenty of issues still, and I think of this stuff every day, and I've still got stuff to work through. I have to uproot the ego stuff and get rid of it. And if you know that's what's going on, then you have a very clear destiny, okay? The destiny is this. To attain the infinite spirit, I must perceive the unity in each of you, right? And to win as a team, you must perceive the unity in everyone else.